There are chapters of history never written in ink, but in fire, in blood, and in secrets deliberately buried for centuries. They are not preserved in textbooks, but in charred scraps of parchment, in the whispers of cloisters, and in the faint traces left in places no one dared to admit they had reached. The history we are taught is only half the truth. The other half was erased, concealed, or locked away in archives never meant to be opened, and yet among the ashes fragments remain, hinting at something astonishing, even unsettling. That the Knights Templar did not vanish as the chronicles insist. They escaped, they sailed, and with them they carried forbidden maps, instruments of navigation guarded in medieval Europe like weapons of war, and perhaps a mission the world was never meant to uncover. Tonight we trace their path, through fire and fog, across oceans and deserts, to face a question official history refuses to answer. Did the last knights of Christendom chart a course to the legendary 7 cities of gold? Long before Columbus ever set sail, if you are drawn to the secrets history tried to silence, follow this trail to the very end. Because sometimes the truth is not in what we are told, but in what was forced to remain hidden. An extraordinary map once surfaced, its faded ink sketching a path not eastward but westward, across fragile parchment. It was no ordinary curiosity. Its markings revealed knowledge of lands no medieval cartographer should have known. There was no mention of Jerusalem, no trace of Solomon's temple. Instead, a cryptic inscription appeared, and 7 small golden crosses scattered across the margins like silent, unblinking stars. The year was 1351. By then, the Knights Templar were gone, burned, scattered, erased from the record. At least that is what the world believed. But this map told a different story. A perilous voyage across an ocean no European was supposed to know. A journey that predates Columbus by more than a century. If authentic, this fragile parchment suggests something extraordinary, that the Templars not only survived their brutal suppression, but uncovered a truth the world still is not ready to accept. The conventional history of the Knights Templar is a tragic epic of fire and chains, a magnificent ascent from humble warrior monks to the most formidable and affluent force in medieval Christendom, abruptly curtailed by betrayal, torture, and execution. But for those who delve deeper, this is far from the conclusion of their story. Whispers, fragmentary parchments, suppressed chronicles, and age-old family legends consistently point to something that eluded the grasp of their persecutors. A map, a formidable fleet, an audacious mission, and at the ultimate end of that mission, if the accumulating evidence is to be believed, lies a destination shrouded more in myth than in fact. An entire realm of cities forged not from metaphorical wealth or spiritual enlightenment, but from actual gold. These hidden, fabled cities, shimmering at the very edge of the known world, some called them Cibola, others Quivira. But for the Templars, if the trail truly holds, they were something else entirely. Tonight we embark on this investigative journey, traversing flames, fog, oceans, and deserts, to seriously confront an impossible question. Did the last Knights of Christendom chart a course to the legendary 7 cities of gold? No screams pierced the night, only the resonant crack of sails caught by the wind, the rhythmic slap of water against the hull, and an unsettling, profound silence. It was 1307. As the sun dipped below the horizon of La Rochelle, bathing the harbor in a golden hue, the formidable Templar fleet, once Western Europe's most potent naval power, slipped away, not into the mist but irrevocably into legend. What transpired next remains a perplexing void in historical accounts. Their ships were never officially recovered, their cargo never logged, and the Order's extensive maritime archives, maps, ledgers, correspondences vanished with the same chilling precision that dismantled the Order itself. The purge commenced on Friday, October 13th, a date now steeped in superstition. Under the direct orders of King Philip IV of France, Templar Knights were arrested en masse, facing charges ranging from heresy and idol worship to secret and obscene rituals. Most of these accusations would swiftly crumble under genuine scrutiny, but such scrutiny was never truly permitted. Interrogations were conducted under relentless torture, confessions extracted and signed in blood. Papal authority, once a protective shield, buckled under immense political pressure. Pope Clement XI, residing in Avignon under the king's dominion, issued a bull officially dissolving the order. Yet amidst this fiery destruction, a colder, more intriguing anomaly emerges. Within Templar correspondence, a curious footnote persists. A shipping ledger scribbled merely days before the arrests. It meticulously refers to a final transfer of precious materials to the Western Fleet, the very fleet docked in La Rochelle, the same fleet that was never officially seen again. Fleets demonstrably do not simply vanish. Ships leave indelible trails, dock records, cargo manifests, tax documents, wreckage. The utter absence of any substantial trace compels a singular, unavoidable question. Were they deliberately hidden? And far more critically, why? One obscure letter, archived in the Vatican but only made public in the early 20th century, mentioned dangerous instruments of navigation being removed from Templar command prior to their dissolution. This phrase seems innocuous until one grasps that medieval Europe regarded advanced navigational tools with the same gravity a modern military would classify nuclear codes. Compass variants, sophisticated star charts, even experimental astrolabes. These were not mere curiosities, they were geopolitical weapons. If the Templars possessed maps not merely of the Mediterranean but of the vast open Atlantic, it would have been sufficient to ignite widespread panic in both secular and ecclesiastical power centers. La Rochelle was not just any port. It served as the Order's primary Atlantic hub, fiercely protected by imposing walls and an unswervingly loyal local Templar commander. Some chroniclers even asserted that its harbor housed specially reinforced vessels, built not for speed but for unparalleled endurance, precisely the kind of ships capable of surviving prolonged voyages into uncharted waters. If true, these were vastly different from the sleek galleys of the Mediterranean. These ships were more akin to Norse Nars or early carracks, heavier with deeper hulls, perfectly suited for traversing something far wider than the English Channel. But here, a strange, persistent echo resonates, lingering like smoke. In 1351, almost half a century after the arrests, a parchment inexplicably materialized, not in France, but in Portugal. Its script was not Latin, but a peculiar fusion of medieval Galician Portuguese and coded Templar shorthand. Upon it, a compelling depiction of a landmass adorned with 7 golden crosses. The map bore no signature, no date, yet a marginal note cryptically read, "From the refuge that left La Rochelle." This marks the first reappearance of that city in connection with the Order after its devastating fall, and it does so not in a chronicle or a sermon, but on a navigational chart. Scholars have fiercely debated the parchment's authenticity since its emergence from a Lisbon monastery archive in the early 1800s. Some denounce it as a forgery, a Romantic-era hoax designed to ignite nationalist pride. Others meticulously cite the ink's composition, the parchment's verifiable age, and the script style as undeniably consistent with late 14th century Iberia. Then there is the map itself, which astonishingly appears to depict a landmass uncannily resembling parts of the Gulf of Mexico and southwestern North America, centuries before their official charting. This is where a profound unease takes root. If the Templar fleet indeed escaped, and if they carried navigational materials westward, then that knowledge had to be meticulously preserved. Not in France, not in Rome, but somewhere off the official record, hidden, not erased, merely awaiting discovery. What if the archive did not perish with the Order? What if it quietly floated away under a moonless sky towards a horizon that most of Europe still believed was the edge of the world? Imagine standing on the rugged cliffs of Galicia as a biting wind sweeps in from the west. Below, a solitary ship glides past the edge of sight, its black and white sails trimmed for silence, its hull heavy with salt and a purpose far older than timber. This is how the rumors began, not in official books or royal decrees, but in hushed fishing villages and monastery corridors, where monks whispered of knights transformed into mariners, and fishermen swore they had glimpsed crosses gleaming on sails bound for nowhere. The concept initially seems preposterous, knights navigating the treacherous high seas. Yet as the 14th century unfolded, these whispers steadily intensified. The Templars, it was increasingly suggested, were not solely formidable warriors and astute bankers. They were also accomplished navigators. One undeniable truth resists easy dismissal. The Templars owned and operated some of the most advanced ports in medieval Europe, particularly along the western fringe. La Rochelle, of course, stands out, but records from ports near Lisbon and Porto consistently indicate unusually high volumes of trade with unlisted merchants. This curious term surfaces repeatedly in surviving ledgers. Traders without names, cargo without declared value, and destinations cryptically marked as outer waters. While vague enough to be dismissed when paired with reports from Arabic geographers describing ships sighted on Atlantic currents, vessels unlike any known to Moorish fleets, the mystery deepens considerably. Arabic sea charts from the 12th and 13th centuries vaguely depict islands west of the Azores. Some even feature annotations referencing places where the sun lingers. One Andalusian map, kept secret until its rediscovery in 1909, includes a sketched vessel near a label that translates as Pilgrims of the Cross. While some argue this is mere metaphor, others note that the ship depicted bears no resemblance to Islamic styles, instead mirroring the squared stern and rounded hull characteristic of European knightly transports. Now our inquiry shifts from mere cartography into profound controversy. A growing, albeit minority, group of maritime historians proposes that the Templars may have benefited significantly from exchanges with Islamic navigators. This was not achieved through conquest as later Europeans would, but through a shared intellectual curiosity. During the Crusades, unusual alliances were occasionally forged in prison cells during protracted sieges and through ransom negotiations. Arabic star charts and astrolabes were highly coveted. A Templar commander in Acre is documented to have paid a substantial sum for a set of Moorish instruments just years before the city's eventual fall. This intermingling of knowledge raises a question few dared to ask publicly. What if the Templars possessed the tools to journey farther than anyone realized, but deliberately chose to maintain absolute secrecy? Not for personal gain, nor even for glory, but for profound preservation. If they were transporting something sacred, something profoundly dangerous, or if they sought a new homeland beyond the oppressive reach of papal bulls and royal courts, then secrecy was not merely an option, it was essential for survival. And what of the portolans? These medieval navigational maps drawn with radiating lines that appear chaotic to the modern eye, actually encoded incredibly precise directions. A particularly curious specimen, dated to the late 1300s and unearthed in a Venetian archive, displays not only the standard Mediterranean routes but also lines extending boldly westward far beyond the known islands. It culminates in an artistic flourish, a swirl perhaps, but beneath it in faded ink is the phrase Via Templaria. Many dismiss this as a mere copyist's embellishment. Yet others remain unconvinced because when this very map was meticulously compared to a later Portuguese chart from 1471 drawn decades before Columbus, it revealed something truly astonishing. The line from Venice ending in the Templar swirl, aligned almost perfectly with a documented wind and current route leading directly to the Caribbean's northern edge. A mere coincidence? Perhaps. But history, particularly when recalling Columbus's own letter to his son mentioning older maps hinting at lands to the west, proves stubbornly persistent. He never divulged his sources, but among the documents he studied in Lisbon were copies of older portolan fragments, several of which are now missing. The archivist at the time, a man with known ties to the Order of Christ, Portugal's successor to the Templars, reportedly restricted access to one specific scroll, claiming it was not meant for foreign eyes. The implication was chillingly clear. This was not simply a matter of exploration, it was a matter of inheritance. This brings us back to the fading footprints left by those clandestine navigators. No grand tombs bear their names, no chronicles extol their courage. Yet a few dusty entries in monastic journals speak of prolonged absences of brethren dispatched to the ocean frontier and of peculiar coins brought back from nowhere. One account even describes a returning brother whose boots were lined with the sands of another world. Boots, sand, stars, charts, ships that vanish and reappear in equal measure, existing between story and silence. When interwoven, these disparate elements form something akin to a path, one perhaps intended not to be followed by all, but remembered only by those who had already traversed it. Thus, we must confront the unavoidable question. Did the Templars simply burn as the history books so definitively claim? Or did they bravely sail, carrying with them not merely relics or treasure, but maps drawn in secret ink, pointing unequivocally toward a land where gold did not merely glitter in rivers, but was profoundly embedded in the knowledge beneath them. Sagres, a small, windswept Portuguese promontory, appears easily overlooked on any modern map. Remote, serene, far removed from the vibrant chaos of Lisbon or the grandeur of Seville. Yet centuries ago, this rocky outcrop represented the very edge of the known world, a place where the stars intensified and the sea stretched into boundless myth. For the Knights Templar, Sagres transcended mere geography. It was a critical listening post, a vital workshop, a potent threshold, and eventually, a void. Following the Order's brutal suppression in France, Portugal took an astonishing, almost unthinkable step. It offered them protection. King Dinis, perhaps shrewdly sensing the shifting political currents, or honoring forgotten debts of gratitude, rebranded the surviving Templars as the Order of Christ. The same knights, a new name, different robes. Yet the strategic ports they controlled, the formidable ships they sailed, and the enigmatic maps they guarded remained eerily familiar. Sagres emerged as one of these crucial holdouts. Remote, inherently defensible, and perfectly positioned to either observe the Atlantic or to escape into its vastness. Historians universally agree that Prince Henry the Navigator, the enigmatic architect of Portugal's Age of Discovery, later established his famed school of navigation at Sagres. He meticulously gathered cartographers, mathematicians, and sea captains, many of whom possessed undeniable ties to the Order of Christ. However, what receives considerably less discussion is this. By the time Henry arrived in the early 15th century, Sagres already boasted established facilities. Robust stone structures, a functioning observatory, and critically, a sealed archive room located beneath its chapel. Documentation of this archive is tantalizingly sparse. A fleeting mention in a royal inventory notes charts of the Western Void locked in cipher. Another refers to an instrumentum magna, a great tool, preserved in waxed cloth. No diagrams were ever included, no further descriptions exist. And then sometime between 1420 and 1440, all references to this archive simply vanish. Not burned, not explicitly destroyed, merely absent. This disappearance would be unsettling enough on its own. But its sinister nature intensifies when viewed against its precise chronological coincidence with the dramatic rise of official Portuguese exploration. Suddenly, a flurry of ambitious expeditions commenced, pushing relentlessly south along Africa, westward toward Madeira and beyond, all supposedly fueled by unprecedented breakthroughs in navigation. Yet none of these voyages explicitly cite Sagres as a launch point, despite its perfect strategic location, its profound history, and the unequivocal fact that records show at least 3 deep-water vessels were constructed there between 1402 and 1409, ships that subsequently never reappeared in royal fleet lists. There is an understandable temptation to attribute this to flawed record-keeping. Medieval archives were hardly paragons of consistency. But Sagres defies this easy explanation. For a place purportedly central to Portugal's maritime ascendancy, it leaves an oddly shallow historical footprint. Travelers wrote of its relentless winds, its iconic lighthouse, its eerie quiet, but almost none described the actual studies conducted there. One friar passing through in 1436 famously remarked, "The stones remember more than the scribes allow." A poetic turn of phrase, yet it gains considerable weight when one considers the profound silence that followed. This leads us to a highly controversial interpretation. Some scholars contend that the facility at Sagres did not originate as a royal initiative at all. Rather, it was a covert Templar site, experimental in nature, and already meticulously equipped with materials later repurposed by Henry the Navigator. In essence, Portugal's golden age of exploration may have been illuminated by the dying embers of the Templar torch. The sophisticated charts, the precise star tables, the exquisitely calibrated instruments, these were not innovated at Sagres, they were inherited. A curious stone relief positioned above the chapel's west-facing door further deepens the intrigue. It unmistakably depicts a cog, a medieval ship, with pronounced reinforced hull lines. Inside, however, are not sailors or saints, but robed figures, each with a sword strapped across their backs. And above the vessel, an engraving of 7 stars. Not a recognized constellation, but 7 evenly spaced points. One might dismiss this as coincidence until one recalls the 7 golden crosses that appeared on that controversial map from Portugal almost a century later. 7 marks, 7 stars, 7 cities. This compelling echo stirs a potent realization, the probability that this profound knowledge was transferred quietly, deliberately, and exclusively to those deemed truly worthy. The burning of Templar records in France may have been a loud public spectacle, but the erasure of Templar tools in Portugal was a silent, methodical act, which in many ways is far more unsettling. If Sagres served as a lighthouse for forbidden knowledge, then someone methodically dimmed that light not by outright destruction, but by seamlessly folding it into something else. A grand royal project, a national mission, an official history that conveniently allowed the past to vanish behind the narrative of progress. Yet every so often the cracks appear, in misdated charts, in star patterns that defy their supposed era, in navigators who discovered lands they had inexplicably already plotted. The silence of Sagres does not merely echo, it absorbs, and that unequivocally renders it far more dangerous, because history famously remembers flames, but it rarely remembers what was so carefully hidden before the match was even struck. The chapel stood locked, not by force but by an ancient tradition. In the venerable old quarter of Cordoba, nestled between whitewashed alleyways and the murmur of orange trees, lies a forgotten stone sanctuary, part mosque, part church, entirely steeped in history. It is absent from most tourist maps, and locals refer to it as La Capilla del Silencio, the Chapel of Silence, a name that in retrospect feels more like an ominous warning than a poetic flourish. Inside, etched into the back wall behind the altar, lies a symbol so cryptic, so geographically anomalous, that it has confounded scholars, theologians, and code breakers for over 2 centuries. A symbol that just might be the oldest waypoint on a path leading towards something no medieval knight should have known. A land beyond the sea, profoundly marked by 7. The carving itself is shallow, faded, and easily missed unless the late afternoon light illuminates it just so. A vertical line bisected by 3 slanted strokes, almost resembling a broken compass. beneath it a row of 7 dots arranged in a loose arch, and to its left an elongated oval adorned with spines, a crude yet unmistakable depiction of a cactus. This in southern Spain long before any documented contact with the Americas, long before cactus was even a word in European tongues. For years it was dismissed as a symbolic, artistic flourish, a meaningless design. However, in 1923, a linguist visiting from Mexico observed a startling resemblance between the carving and glyphs found on ancient Mesoamerican codices, particularly the representation of Chicome, the number 7, frequently associated with divinity and abundance. He penned a brief paper on his discovery, which was largely ignored. Most Spanish historians saw no compelling reason to believe a cactus and a numeric symbol could imply anything other than colonial-era influence. Except the chapel demonstrably predates the conquest by over a century. It was built by former Templars who had seamlessly integrated into local religious life under assumed identities. Their names appear in land grants and tax registries. They were affluent, well-connected, and conspicuously quiet. No children, no scandals, just quiet gatherings every equinox. The church bells reportedly rang at odd hours, and sometimes foreign guests arrived. Dark-bearded men speaking a blend of Arabic and Latin, which a contemporary scribe found unsettling. One account buried in the margin of a 15th century ecclesiastical record mentions a scroll read in the Western tongue during one of these gatherings. The scribe dismissed it as heresy, yet he meticulously noted one line that haunted him. The 7th mark lies where the sun sleeps in cactus stone. This sounds like poetic nonsense until one stands in that chapel, truly observing that wall and realizing that the symbol is not merely a strange carving, it is undeniably a map key. When overlaid with a faded Templar chart discovered in Porto in 1767, the dots align precisely with a sweep of points leading westward across the Atlantic. The oval, when reversed and enlarged, startlingly resembles a stylized basin. Some scholars believe it represents a gulf. Others contend it points to a specific site in the American Southwest where unique stone formations eerily resemble jagged thorns rising from the desert floor. The compelling echo from earlier findings resurfaces. 7 marks, 7 stars, 7 cities. Always 7. But now these are inextricably linked to a chapel that has no historical right to contain American flora, to medieval knights with no known connection to Mesoamerican numerology, and to a code that should not exist outside missionary archives from centuries later. Controversial interpretations have predictably flourished. Some suggest the carving was added later by a visitor from the New World. Others argue it's a mere coincidence, a stylistic quirk mistakenly imbued with significance. Yet these arguments lose considerable ground when examined alongside the chapel's unique orientation. Unlike most Christian sanctuaries of that era, which invariably face east towards Jerusalem, this one faces directly west. Not towards Rome, not even towards Santiago de Compostela, but simply west. Some scholars assert this was to honor the Virgin of the Setting Sun, a localized Marian devotion. However, records of that particular cult are conveniently absent until the 1500s, and even then they are vague, almost as if conveniently invented to rationalize a choice no one could logically justify. Then there is the matter of the scroll that purportedly accompanied the carving. Now lost, but mentioned in an 1830s travelogue. The author described a piece of vellum stored in the church sacristy, bearing an illustration of a crowned figure kneeling beside 7 burning towers. He emphatically swore the figure wore the red cross of the Templars. No photographs were ever taken. The scroll vanished during political unrest. All that remains is his journal entry smudged with ink and doubt. Still, critical questions persist. Why would a group of exiled knights carve a cactus into a chapel wall? Why would they whisper of 7 marks and read from scrolls in dead languages? And why, above all, would they orient their house of worship not towards salvation, but towards a desert no one yet believed existed? The silence of Sagres was one profound thing. It concealed through omission. But the chapel in Cordoba, it speaks softly, strangely, as if daring someone someday to listen intently enough and crucially to follow. The fire was already ablaze. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood chained atop a modest scaffold near the Seine, the sky behind him a swirling vortex of dusk and smoke. He uttered no screams, offered no pleas. He simply stared, some witnesses claimed, towards Notre Dame. Others asserted he gazed resolutely westward. Amidst the legends, one fact remains immutable. As his body turned to ash in 1314, his name was seared into 1,000 myths. And within those myths, like a splinter lodged deep within the skin of history, persists the most enduring rumor of all, that de Molay foresaw the impending catastrophe and meticulously ensured that not everything would perish with him. Most accounts of the final purge describe the arrests of Templar leadership as sudden and absolute. Coordinated raids, surprise warrants, confessions extorted under torture. Yet the timeline, upon closer inspection, is far from clean. In the weeks leading up to October 13th, unusual movements were documented along France's western coast. Coded letters were dispatched from Paris to La Rochelle. Monasteries reported extraordinary requests for provisions. And a royal agent stationed near the port meticulously recorded the sudden disappearance of several Templar vessels just days before the king's decree was enacted. One obscure chronicle from the Abbey of Fontaine asserts that de Molay dispatched 3 sealed letters during this critical period, each entrusted to a different knight, each bound for a distinct destination. One to Portugal, one to Scotland, and one, curiously, to a hidden house across the water where the sun is last. This final line is easily romanticized, but when considered within the context of contemporary maritime movements, it reads less like poetry and more like precise coordinates. A French nobleman, Louis de Jaucourt, later claimed that his father had harbored one of these messengers for a single night in 1313. The knight, described as aged and weathered yet remarkably calm, carried a satchel containing a metal cylinder sealed with wax and stamped with the Templar sigil. The Jaucourt family preserved the memory but tragically lost the object, allegedly confiscated during the 100 Years' War. However, a sketch of the seal survives in their family archive. It depicts the traditional cross undeniably, but encircled by a ring of 7 dots. This is not a known Templar symbol, nor an ecclesiastical one, just 7. There is that number again, persistently re-emerging. A more controversial detail lies in the mention of a fleet beneath the rose. This phrase appears in a Templar interrogation transcript, one of the few that escaped destruction. where an imprisoned knight under intense questioning refers to those who fled beneath the rose and into the veil. At first glance, this sounds like sheer nonsense, but sub rosa, beneath the rose, was a well-established medieval idiom for secrecy, still in use today. And the veil has long been a coded reference for the Western Ocean. This brings us to an obscure but profoundly tantalizing historical fact. The Order maintained a second fleet smaller than the one at La Rochelle, based at a lesser-known port near Vannes in Brittany. Most Templar documents refer to it only in passing, as a mere logistical depot. However, a 17th century scholar meticulously working from older charters noted that the Vannes location had significantly expanded its docks in 1305 and received unknown guests with large supply caravans in 1306. This timeline precisely aligns with de Molay's final years of freedom. Did he indeed prepare for the inevitable collapse? If so, it would explain the fleet's disappearance not as a panicked escape, but as a meticulously pre-planned migration. And if they sailed, the most probable direction was not north, it was decisively west. Recall that by this time, Norse colonies had already been established in Greenland. Rumors of a further landmass beyond it circulated among fishermen. Basque sailors whispered of impossible currents, and the Templars, with their extensive, wide-reaching networks, would have heard all of it. More importantly, they would have meticulously recorded it. This brings us to the most elusive document of all, the rumored Map of Molay. First referenced by a 16th century monk named Father Guillaume Ducler, it was said to depict not only known ports, but a chain of stars leading westward from the Azores. The map was allegedly kept in the library of Sion, later tragically destroyed in a fire. No copy survives, but Ducler's description remains chillingly precise. A sacred path by star and cross to the land of refuge. Skeptics contend the monk embellished, possibly even fabricated this account. Yet a few curious details from his text align uncannily with geographical discoveries made centuries later. One particular island, described as crescent-shaped with a central lagoon, strikingly matches the modern outline of Antigua. Another, noted as the Crowned Basin, may correspond to the Bay of Campeche. Are these mere coincidences? Perhaps. Or perhaps the fleet carried with it more than just knights and gold. Perhaps it carried meticulously compiled instructions, a final sacred mission, a predetermined destination. And it forces one to ponder. If Jacques de Molay did orchestrate an escape, if he ensured the survival of knowledge deemed too dangerous for either church or crown, then what precisely was waiting at the end of that sea trail? Was it gold, priceless relics, or something far more profound? Something that needed to be concealed until the world was finally ready to understand. Gold is an irresistible magnet for myth. It glitters, it vanishes, and it possesses the power to drag entire empires towards ruin with nothing more than a whispered rumor. By the time Spanish conquistadors sailed westward, the legend of the 7 cities of gold, Cibola and Quivira, had already calcified into an all-consuming obsession. They relentlessly marched through scorching deserts, burned countless villages, and pursued mirages across vast, unforgiving landscapes, all in pursuit of towers supposedly plated in sunlight. What most historians consistently overlook is this critical detail. The story did not originate in the Americas. It began in Europe, And it began far earlier than anyone is truly willing to admit. One established fact, frequently disregarded, is that the earliest mention of 7 golden cities appears not in a New World account, but in a 12th century Iberian manuscript, the Chronicon Lusitanum. This Portuguese chronicle, primarily focused on reconquests and court affairs, makes an astonishing detour to describe fleeing bishops who set sail from Merida, carrying sacred relics and maps to a land beyond the sea where cities shimmered in God's bounty. The phrasing is ornate, but the implication is undeniably clear. 7 bishops, 7 ships, 7 cities. Long before Columbus, the number 7 had already become inextricably linked with tales of sanctuary and splendor across the Atlantic. Mainstream historians conveniently label this an allegory, a Christian retelling of paradise. Yet, nestled precariously between allegory and verifiable archive lies a profound question. How did so many medieval Europeans come to genuinely believe there was something valuable, something tangible awaiting them in the West? Not heaven, not allegory, but actual gold. The Templars, ever attuned to whispered currents, would not have dismissed such rumors. Their formidable financial empire was not built on faith alone. They were shrewd traders, astute bankers, and brilliant tacticians. They gathered intelligence as readily as they amassed relics. And during the Reconquista, their pervasive presence across the Iberian Peninsula placed them in constant direct contact with Mozarabic scholars, Christians living under Islamic rule who possessed unparalleled access to Arabic scientific texts, including captivating tales of strange islands to the west. One such text, the Maghreb Treatise of al-Masudi, specifically references sailors who returned from a voyage to a green land with mountains like gold. This description was penned in the 10th century. Later, in the Templar stronghold of Tomar, a partial translation of that very treatise was catalogued, its margins profusely littered with annotations in Latin and Galician. One chilling note reads, "Marked the 4th star in the western sky. Travel from there 6 days with the wind." If this sounds like a navigational instruction, that is precisely because it likely was. But here's the uncomfortable truth, the persistent echo that refuses to dissipate. That number again. 7 cities, 7 bishops, 7 stars. A systematic arrangement of marks, perhaps a coded trail. The very same pattern found on the lost map in Portugal. The identical count carved into the chapel wall in Cordoba. It becomes increasingly difficult to ignore when one considers the compelling oral legends of indigenous groups in the American Southwest. The Zuni people, for instance, speak of Kibila, a sacred place of origin associated with 7 sacred villages often situated towards the east in their cosmology. Spanish friars, upon hearing these tales, immediately but imperially linked them to Cibola. Their assumption was as colonial as it was profoundly misguided. Yet, the coincidence of 7 sacred sites linked to gold and holiness echoed too perfectly for the Templars to have missed it, had they arrived first. This is where the narrative shifts from probable to provocatively speculative. A controversial interpretation whispered among a fringe group of medievalists suggests that the gold was never literal, that cities of gold referred not to currency or treasure, but to places of profound wisdom, knowledge centers meticulously left behind by an older, forgotten civilization. They point to the recurrent use of the Latin term aurum spirituale, spiritual gold, in several Templar sermons. The implication being that the order may have deliberately encoded the promise of literal gold as a lure, when what they were truly pursuing was enlightenment or perhaps concealment. Even so, gold existed in the Americas in abundant quantities long before Europeans arrived. If the Templars reached the shores of Mesoamerica or the Southwest even briefly, they would have witnessed the exquisite craftsmanship, the ornate temples, the meticulously laid offerings at the feet of gods. Did they mistakenly believe these to be the cities of the bishops? Or did they more cunningly plant the seed of the legend themselves, understanding that the story would eventually mutate into something far more powerful? One obscure document from the 1500s, filed among the dispatches of Spanish explorer Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, references strange ruins to the north marked with the sign of the cross. His expedition famously failed to locate the fabled gold. Yet they did discover Pueblo cities, well organized, vast, and ancient. One soldier described them as holy places cast in sun, though he conceded they possessed no treasure but the wind and the whisper. The same whisper, perhaps, that carried across the Atlantic centuries before. That spoke of 7 golden cities drawing men in armor across oceans, not because they believed in magic, but because they believed someone else already knew the way. Genoa was not a city of saints. It thrived on salt, silver, and clandestine deals, its harbor perpetually thick with maritime gossip and sea spray. While Venice reveled in spectacle and Florence basked in golden leaf, Genoa preferred its secrets. And among its many trades, the discreet copying of maps ranked supremely high. Portolans flowed through its docks like vital blood through veins destined for sea captains, astute merchants, or men who deliberately never offered their names. Most were practical, densely crowded with familiar coasts, but one, now seared into legend, dared to chart the unthinkable. A western landmass far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, bearing no label, only 7 geometric marks. This map, known solely from meticulous descriptions and a single surviving sketch, is attributed to Pietro Visconti's Circle, a group of 14th century Genoese cartographers notorious for fearlessly pushing geographical boundaries. One particular sheet, intercepted by papal agents in 1372, contained a depiction of an elongated island west of the Azores, annotated in Latin, Regnum Solis, the kingdom of the sun. Beside it, someone had meticulously inked 7 small towers, equidistant, each crowned with a tiny cross. The script was unmistakably Templar shorthand. The paper itself bore the watermark of a scriptorium demonstrably tied to the Order of Christ in Lisbon. This, to put it mildly, was not considered standard navigational fare. Officially, the Church swiftly dismissed the map as pure fantasy, and it was quickly interred within the inquisitorial archives. However, not before a Portuguese envoy managed to painstakingly copy portions of it by hand. That copy, now brittle and browned by the relentless march of time, dramatically resurfaced in the 19th century. It ignited a quiet tempest among historians, most of whom immediately questioned its authenticity. Yet the intricate details, especially the precise placement of currents and coastal winds, uncannily matched real Atlantic data. data not publicly known until at least a century later. So how did 14th century cartographers acquire such astounding precision? The conventional explanation posits extrapolation. The audacious answer suggests they were working from older, now lost sources, quite possibly Templar in origin. Genoa had long been a critical hub for Eastern contact. Returning crusaders, erudite Moorish translators, even remnants of Cathar exiles. Knowledge flowed through it like smuggled incense. And among those bearers of arcane knowledge were men who no longer called themselves knights, but scribes, former Templars in meticulously crafted disguise. The Church had, of course, branded them heretics, and in some instances they may have justly deserved that label. A few of their maps depict the Garden of Eden not in the east, as was customary, but near the mouth of the Orinoco River. Others display an inverted world with Jerusalem demoted from its central position. Heresy, certainly, but also profound curiosity. Here is where the story truly sharpens. One chronicler, writing anonymously under the pseudonym M.H. Algenovis, claimed to have seen a black-bound folio in Genoa's port records, annotated by a former Templar known only as Thibaut. The folio purportedly described a voyage undertaken not for conquest, but for meticulous concealment, and referenced a chain of islands whose light cannot be weighed. The phrasing borders on the mystical. But the phrase, sevenfold shield of God's house, repeats throughout, and once again the number 7 rises from the parchment like an unscratchable itch. A compelling echo surfaces here, the same sequence of 7 marks observed in the Cordoba Chapel, the same 7 dots on the Lisbon map, the same 7 crosses etched onto ships that may have vanished from La Rochelle. The identical motif re-emerging, not in monastic texts, but in a mariner's sketchbook buried deep within Genoa's salt-rhymed vaults. Critics argue this is merely pattern-seeking, that 7 is a sacred number in countless traditions, and that gold, mystery, and maps naturally attract such symbols. Fair enough. But then we encounter the Tabula Ignota, a fragment discovered in 1891 meticulously wrapped inside a forgotten Genoese codex. It displays the Atlantic basin as expected, but west of the Azores, it distinctly marks a jagged, unnamed coastline alongside 7 points labeled Civitas Aura, golden cities. The handwriting is uneven, but meticulous analysis dated the ink to the late 1300s. Long before Columbus, long before the Treaty of Tordesillas drew invisible lines across invisible lands. And then there is the inescapable figure of Columbus himself. His brother Bartolomeo, trained in cartography, likely in Genoa, consulted numerous maps in Lisbon. Many were Genoese copies discreetly circulated among select circles. One early draft bears a strange correction, a western landmass initially labeled Antillia, then crossed out, replaced with Terra Novi Crucis, land of the New Cross. Was this merely guesswork, or was it a profound memory? Because if those heretic cartographers were working from something older, something forbidden, then the 7 cities of gold were not an invention of conquistadors. They were an inheritance passed down to map makers, preserved not as fantastical tales, but as precise coordinates. Coordinates written in shorthand, masked by metaphor, and transferred from Templar to trader to explorer, whispered, redrawn, encoded, patiently waiting waiting for someone bold or desperate enough to truly follow. If you find yourself on the southern shore of Nova Scotia, just as dusk descends, direct your gaze downward. Past the pine needles, past the sea-smoothed stones, past the profound silence that settles like a thick fog. Some claim you will find them there, etchings on slate, barely visible, worn smooth by centuries of relentless wind and tide. Runes, letters, or mere graffiti, depending on whom you ask. But for over 200 years, the rocks of Oak Island and the nearby coasts have whispered the same persistent question. Who carved these? And why do they appear undeniably European? The most renowned site, of course, is the so-called Money Pit, a shaft meticulously dug deep into the earth, lined with timber, stone platforms, and curious layers of coconut fiber. Coconut notably does not grow in Canada. Its discovery in the late 1700s ignited a frenzy of excavations, theories, and lawsuits. Most attributed it to pirates. Some inexplicably blamed Shakespeare, but a persistent few turned their gaze to the enigmatic Red Cross of the Templars. One established fact, frequently lost in the sensational storytelling, is that the earliest mention of strange symbols on Oak Island came not from thrill-seeking adventurers, but from local fishermen. In the mid-18th century, they recounted finding foreign letters on boulders near the island's swamp. Later accounts meticulously documented an inscribed stone, reportedly pulled from the pit, engraved with characters no one could translate. The stone itself has conveniently vanished. Yes, convenient, yet a copy survives. Its symbols bear a striking resemblance to a cipher used by Cistercian monks who, not coincidentally, maintained close ties to the Templar order. Now, it is one thing to suggest that medieval Europeans made landfall in the New World. It is quite another to propose they left coded messages beneath elaborately engineered shafts. But here is where the narrative becomes truly unsettling. A rock outcropping inland, several kilometers north of Oak Island, bears a carving of 7 dots arranged in a crescent. The identical formation from Cordoba, the same count from the Lisbon map. Etched beside it is what appears to be a rudimentary cross with flared ends, almost a fleur-de-lis, almost a Templar seal. Critics predictably roll their eyes. Natural erosion, they scoff. Vandalism, overactive imagination. Yet the pattern does not dissipate under scrutiny, it sharpens. In 1897, a historian named Henry Ramsden reported an even stranger discovery. A sandstone tablet half buried in a cove, marked with a vertical staff and several diagonal lines. When meticulously copied and compared, the symbol bore a striking resemblance to the compass rose design utilized in early Mediterranean navigation. Except it was off-center, tilted distinctly towards the northwest. Ramsden believed it to be a land-based directional marker. Others believe it was a signature. Even stranger are the cross trees. These are upright stones several feet high, found in a triangular formation along the coast. Initially dismissed as simple boundary markers or burial stones when meticulously measured and plotted on a map, their alignment points unequivocally towards the Bay of Fundy and beyond it due west. Not magnetic west, but solar west. The alignment precisely tracks with the sunset on the spring equinox. Why would local stones be arranged by solar compass? Why would anyone undertake such an effort unless they were leaving a message, not for the present, but for a returning party? And here emerges a compelling echo, subtle yet unmistakable. One Genoese map fragment specifically described an island with twin rivers and iron-rooted trees as the northernmost point of the sevenfold route. Nova Scotia possesses such rivers. It boasts iron-rich soil, and its evergreens, particularly the red spruce, send down roots that twist like wire. The Genoese map explicitly labeled this site Domus Septima, seventh house. Controversial interpretations abound, of course. Some assert the carvings are colonial in origin or later hoaxes. Others suggest they were created by Basque whalers or Norse explorers. But the cross-sections of evidence, ciphered stones, precise solar alignments, undeniable symbolic echoes, form a pattern too stubborn to entirely dismiss, especially when paired with later French documents hinting at ancient Christian foundations discovered by early explorers but deliberately covered over to evade church scrutiny. Even the Mi'kmaq, the indigenous people of the region, recount stories of pale-skinned strangers arriving long ago, not with fire and theft, but with gifts and profound silence. They speak of symbols carved in rock, of rituals conducted at sunset, of songs sung beneath the earth, songs, stones, symbols, the fundamental elements of a secret not shouted but carefully buried. And perhaps that is the most Templar gesture of all. Not conquest by sword, but a legacy preserved through symbol. A trail meticulously left behind, one mark at a time, patiently waiting for someone not merely to follow it, but to profoundly comprehend the language in which it was written. A language that speaks in runes, in rock, in silence. Montségur should have fallen quietly. Perched precariously high in the French Pyrenees, it was more an impregnable fortress than a mere castle, more a defiant altar than a military outpost. But when it finally succumbed in 1244 after a brutal and protracted siege, it did so in a blaze of fire. 200 Cathars, heretics according to the church, were marched to a field and burned alive. They died singing, not pleading, not cursing, but singing. And for centuries their final notes were swallowed by the unforgiving stone and snow. Yet buried amidst the ashes, meticulously tucked into the wall of a ruined cell, was a parchment. Its ink had faded, its script was strange, and its profound meaning would remain hidden until someone recognized it, not as a prayer, but as a map. The Cathars were Gnostic Christians, often romantically portrayed as pacifists, yet they were renowned for guarding their secrets with a silence sharper than any sword. They embraced a dualistic belief system, two worlds, one light, one dark, and vehemently rejected the perceived material corruption of the church. This naturally made them relentless targets. But what is less commonly acknowledged is that they shared more than beliefs with the Templars. They shared roads, powerful patrons, and in some critical instances, even hiding places. One established fact is that Montségur received several Templar visitors in the years immediately preceding the siege. The records are sparse, but names appear, seemingly dropped. The exact nature of their visits remains undocumented, yet shortly thereafter, significant reinforcements of money and goods were delivered to the castle, far more than a starving sect could ever afford on its own. And then there is the persistent matter of the treasure. During the final desperate days of the siege, 4 Cathars are said to have escaped down the treacherous cliff face with a bundle purportedly containing sacred relics, invaluable documents, or both. No one knows what ultimately became of them, but in 1898, a shepherd seeking refuge during a storm stumbled across a sealed cavity within the ruins. Inside was the parchment, later to be known as the cipher of Montségur. Its symbols were indecipherable at first glance. However, when the same characters were meticulously compared to inscriptions found in Templar chapels, an unmistakable pattern emerged. The cipher bore a striking resemblance to the writing style employed in the Regula Secreta, an encoded Templar rulebook known only to the highest-ranking members of the order. And when partially decrypted, the Montségur text revealed chilling references to a path of the Western Flame and guardians of the Seventh Gate. The phrase Seventh Gate sent palpable ripples through the scholarly community. It powerfully echoed the 7-point motif discovered in Portugal, Spain, Genoa, and even Nova Scotia. But this was the first instance where the number was explicitly paired with the concept of passage. A gate, a threshold, not a city, not a final destination, but a critical crossing. And then something even stranger surfaced, a repeated symbol that appeared near every mention of the gate, a crude diamond shape bisected by a cross with 3 dots at its base. The identical figure appears in a Templar codex found in Languedoc. There it is provocatively named Via Lucis Noctis, the way of the nightlight. Interpretations vary wildly. Some claim it's a metaphor for profound spiritual enlightenment. Others argue it's a literal navigation mark, perhaps a sophisticated star chart or a precise geographic code. One fringe theory, uncomfortable but oddly persistent, proposes that the Templars and Cathars shared access to a clandestine library of forbidden knowledge, one that meticulously traced ancient civilizations, even pre-Christian contact with the Americas, and that Montségur served as one of its hidden vaults. This understandably pushes most academics to the very edge of their comfort zones. Yet it is impossible to dismiss the compelling alignment of these details. The cipher references an island of the red sky where men of the cross dwell beneath the stone sun. On its own, this sounds like fevered mysticism. But consider the oral legends of a stone temple buried deep in the deserts of New Mexico, where petroglyphs depict suns with faces and crosses etched into ancient door lintels. Consider the architectural marvels of early Chaco Canyon, its precise astronomical alignments, its striking absence of war imagery, its strange, echoing geometry. Then consider that some of its rooms were deliberately sealed, not destroyed. A powerful echo forms like a quiet footstep in an empty chamber. The path meticulously traced through symbols and profound secrecy, winding from France to Iberia to Nova Scotia, now hints at a southern arc, as if those who fled did not merely scatter but meticulously curved a crescent, creating a trail, a cipher. Controversial interpretations proliferate, of course. Some vehemently insist the parchment is a forgery, meticulously planted by romantic 19th century occultists. Others claim the decoding was fatally flawed. But even skeptics concede that the cipher's structure is remarkably sophisticated, far beyond the capabilities of typical hoaxes. And its thematic unity, gates, stars, sevenfold symbols, mirrors precisely what independent sites across 3 continents have consistently echoed. So perhaps the Cathars did not die with all their secrets. Perhaps the fire only consumed what was meant to be found. Perhaps the rest, like the survivors who furtively fled Montségur under cover of night, simply moved westward, meticulously following a map written not in ink alone, but in an unwavering belief, because sometimes the most dangerous heresy is not refusing to bow. It is knowing precisely where the door is. They emerged from the sea, yet not with the thunder of cannon fire, nor in fleets bearing imperial banners, nor shouting in Spanish. According to one meticulously preserved Nahuatl oral account, they arrived far earlier, fewer in number, quieter, and cloaked not in iron breastplates but in white. The Aztec scribes, diligent keepers of memory as much as myth, meticulously recorded many phenomena, omens, eclipses, the precise color of birds before battle. But tucked within one codex, copied centuries later by missionary hands, is a chilling reference to pale-skinned visitors who arrived generations before Cortés, offering neither trade nor war, only cryptic symbols, crosses, and profound silence. The Codex Chimalpopoca, often dismissed as legendary in tone, preserves fragments of these enigmatic traditions. One passage speaks of men of the dawn, clothed in purity, who walked like priests but carried blades not for sacrifice. Some interpret this as prophecy retrofitted after the trauma of the conquest. However, other scholars note that the phrasing is distinctly observational, lacking the usual apocalyptic imagery. It reads more like genuine curiosity. Here is where the narrative shifts from poetic to chillingly precise. One early Spanish friar, Bernardino de Sahagún, meticulously recorded the recollections of elders in central Mexico who described foreigners who marked 7 hills before vanishing. 7 hills, not pyramids, not cities, but hills. The number alone sends a chill, that identical numerical motif again appearing in a geography utterly removed from Montségur, Sagres, or Nova Scotia. And yet, here it is, nestled among Aztec recollections like a breadcrumb coated in obsidian dust. Critics predictably suggest these tales emerged post-contact, colored by trauma and theology. But there is a crucial detail that resists such an easy explanation. The visitors, according to one version, departed inland, not back to the sea. They walked into the sun, one elder recounted, toward the stone of fire. That phrase, believed to refer to a sacred volcano or desert altar, aligns curiously with Templar esoteric imagery, particularly the stone sun mentioned in the Montségur cipher and even earlier in Cathar oral legends as the Western Gate of Exile. Now comes the controversial detail. In 1961, during an excavation near Tula, archaeologists unearthed a cache of obsidian knives, beads, and a small carved figure, likely depicting a pilgrim or priest. But tucked inside the very same soil layer was a copper medallion, clearly not of local origin. It bore no Spanish crest, no Latin script, only a worn cross with flared arms and a loop at the base, eerily similar to a Templar cross pate. The artifact was quietly removed, its provenance immediately questioned, and to this day it remains in a private collection. However, photographs were taken and metallurgical testing conducted off-record suggested European-style smelting from before the 16th century. dismissed naturally, too strange, too disruptive, and yet the timelines stubbornly refused to conform. If any group possessed both the motivation and the culture of silence to undertake such a journey, it would be the remnant Templars, men trained in secrecy, survival, and the navigation of celestial paths. But why would they venture inland? Why seek contact with a priestly elite in a land already deeply steeped in spiritual complexity? A few scholars propose an idea not easily published. They were not seeking conversion. They were seeking preservation, knowledge, perhaps even an alliance. The Aztecs, or more accurately, their Toltec predecessors, maintained sophisticated astronomical libraries and architectural alignments older than Tenochtitlan itself. Temples meticulously oriented to solstices, sacred wells mapped to lunar cycles. For exiled knights transformed into scribes, what better place to hide or exchange knowledge than among those who perceived no fundamental difference between stone and star? The echo emerges here with a whisper. The Genoese map marked a crescent-shaped land with 7 towers. The cipher of Montségur referenced a gate. And now the Aztec memory speaks of strangers who passed through hills marked with crosses, then inexplicably disappeared, not conquered, not killed, but vanished. Could they have discovered what they were truly seeking? Not gold, not relics, but profound resonance. One theory, softly spoken among esoteric historians, posits that the 7 cities of gold were not cities in the physical sense, but rather sites of alignment. Places across the earth where certain celestial, magnetic, or spiritual forces converged. The number 7 then becomes not a count of treasures, but a map of harmonics. If so, then the Templars were not hoarding material wealth. They were mapping something far older, something deeply buried, something we have collectively forgotten how to read. And perhaps for a fleeting moment in time, they stood face to face with another civilization that still remembered. 2 worlds, 1 map, drawn not in ink, but in enduring myth. It begins with cold, damp Scottish stone, carved in the 15th century with a precision that not only raises eyebrows, but quickens the pulse. Rosslyn Chapel, nestled just outside Edinburgh, has long been the nucleus of whispered legends. Its columns are riddled with perplexing symbolism. Angels clutch musical instruments with no known historical counterparts. Beams spiral in patterns once deemed impossible to achieve with the tools of the era. And tucked into one unassuming corner of the chapel is something that, by all historical accounts, has no business being there. What appears unmistakably to be maize, corn, carved decades before Columbus ever returned to Europe with samples from the New World. Mainstream archaeologists have predictably dismissed it as stylized flora, artistic whimsy. But maize is unequivocally native to Mesoamerica. It did not grow in Europe. It simply should not be in Rosslyn. And yet it stares back from the stone like a quiet, undeniable confession. One established historical fact is that Rosslyn was constructed under the directorship of William Sinclair, a nobleman whose lineage ran deep through both Scottish aristocracy and Crusader bloodlines. His family maintained undeniable ties to the remnants of the Knights Templar, particularly those who found refuge in Scotland after the Order's catastrophic collapse. And William, it seems, possessed an inherent predilection for secrecy. The chapel's construction was unusually private, the workforce meticulously controlled. The plans, if they ever existed, have never surfaced, and the recurring motifs within the chapel seem less like mere decoration and more like deliberate preservation, as if someone meticulously encoded profound knowledge into sandstone, locking it in plain sight. The connection to the seven cities deepens when one follows the line southward across the Atlantic, past the weathered coastline of Nova Scotia, through inland trails mapped not by colonial explorers but by centuries of oral traditions and enigmatic petroglyphs. In northern New Mexico near the Rio Grande, indigenous ruins speak of an ancient culture with architectural signatures that curiously echo Rosslyn's interior design, not in grandeur but in striking pattern, spiral motifs, triple-beamed lintels, and solar alignments so precise they rival modern observatories. The pueblo of Chaco Canyon, for instance, aligns with the lunar standstill, a rare celestial cycle known only to advanced astronomers. Yet these structures were built centuries before telescopes existed, and their corridors funnel light with an uncanny resemblance to the cloisters of European chapels. A controversial interpretation proposed by architect and historian Jonathan Marin in the 1970s posited a shared symbolic language between certain Southwest ruins and Templar architecture. He was predictably ridiculed. No evidence, no ships, no artifacts. But he persistently pointed to the sacred geometry, the precise ratios carved into both Rosslyn and the Chacon complexes. He argued they were not mere echoes of each other, but profound harmonics emanating from the same original source. This sounds like pure fantasy until one considers an astonishing coincidence. A carved sandstone panel near Acoma Pueblo depicts 7 triangular peaks arranged in a crescent. Beneath them, a vertical beam splitting a circle. To most, it is a spiritual symbol. To Marin, it was something else entirely. A stylized compass rose, a navigational key. When meticulously rotated and matched to medieval Templar portolan patterns, it aligns with an arc across 7 known indigenous settlements, each associated with light-based ceremonies or astronomical markers. The pattern terminates in the ruins of a temple buried in sand, known only by local oral tradition as the House of the Crossed Ones. No physical cross has been found, but nearby petroglyphs display a symmetrical blade, flared at each end. It requires little imagination to recognize a Templar sword, reduced to a timeless stone memory. A compelling echo emerges directly from Rosslyn itself. In one corner of the crypt, beneath a carved angel, lies a barely perceptible inscription. Non omnis moriar, not all of me shall die. This phrase, attributed to Horus, has been adopted by mystics, masons, and martyrs alike. But in this specific context, it feels like a profound whisper across continents. Not all of me shall die. Not all of us vanished. Not all our knowledge was burned. There is no definitive, direct evidence connecting Rosslyn to New Mexico. No ship's log, no scroll. But what endures instead is alignment, pattern, resonance. If the Templars reached the New World, they may have done so without conquest or grand proclamation. They may have walked gently, constructing nothing monumental, but leaving indelible symbols carved into stone and time. Perhaps they understood they could not remain. Perhaps they chose not to. But if they sought a place to safeguard their ultimate truths, the high desert of the Rio Grande, where sky and stone speak in profound silence, would have served as the perfect vault. Not gold, not cities, but song lines etched in stone. And for those who still search with the correct perceptive gaze, perhaps the map never truly disappeared. It simply changed languages. It stood on a solitary hill outside Poitiers, France. Part monastery, part fortress, part archive. To the world, it was known simply as the Commandery of Sainte Marie. To those within the order, it was something far more profound. The tower. Not grand, not gilded, just stone, squat and solemn. But inside it once held something rarer than gold. Maps meticulously stacked, inked, and fiercely guarded. And when the Templar arrests began, those maps were the very first items to vanish. It is an established fact that before their catastrophic fall, the Templars maintained one of their most extensive libraries at this commandery. A dozen scribes worked there full-time, diligently cataloging documents brought in from the Holy Land, Iberia, and the wider Mediterranean. Among these were invaluable maritime scrolls, logs detailing intricate wind patterns, coastal profiles, and precise celestial observations. Some likely acquired through the order's close ties to Islamic scholars in Acre and Alexandria. These were not merely tools for trade. They were instruments of immense power. However, sometime in 1306, nearly a year before the devastating purge, the archive's inventory underwent a puzzling change. Several codices were transferred under mysterious pretexts. A scribe's letter discovered centuries later in the Vatican's side archives notes, "Materials not to be read, sealed, and bound for the long way." This enigmatic phrase reappears in a second note, this time in code, "Via Magna Oltanda," the great route to be concealed. Then just after the arrests began, the tower's inner chamber was found utterly empty. No scrolls, no star maps, no staff. Only one thing remained. A carved stone disc set into the floor depicting a compass rose unlike any seen in Europe. At its center, once again, 7 dots in a ring. The echo is undeniable now, but the tower adds a crucial new dimension. Scale. This was not a mere side project. It was meticulously organized, systematically executed. The logistics alone suggest a highly coordinated transfer of vital materials. Where did they go? One obscure account may hold a compelling clue. In 1783, a French soldier named Renaud Ducy, stationed near Mont-Saint-Michel, recorded a tale from a local monk. The monk claimed that before the revolution, pilgrims occasionally visited under false names, not to pray but to search. They were reportedly looking for a metal chest of Western letters, rumored to have been hidden by a knight in the 14th century. The monk, who clearly held no affection for secrets, said the chest once belonged to the guardians of the sun's path. Whether this chest ever truly existed is unknown, but references to it under various names appear in at least 3 private collections now held in Vienna, Toulouse, and Seville. Each describes a container etched with both a red cross and a serpent winding through stars. One journal claims it held fragments of the drowned lands and a map wrapped in sacred ash. Interpretation spirals quickly. Some believe the tower's contents were secretly smuggled to Portugal and subsequently aboard ships bound west. Others argue they were divided, some buried, some burned, some discreetly passed down through veiled successor orders like the Order of Christ. But what truly lends weight to this theory is not a single source. It is the sudden, inexplicable emergence of profound knowledge shortly after the Templars' fall. In Sagres, as previously noted, complex instruments and celestial charts appeared seemingly from nowhere. Genoese map-makers not known for spiritual inclinations began referencing islands that did not yet exist on any official chart. And in early Portuguese records, there is an anonymous account of a master map, a document so sensitive it could only be viewed by 3 men at a time, under solemn oath. The Templars may have built no cathedrals of stone, but in ink and vellum they constructed cathedrals of possibility, maps not only of land, but of time, of prophecy. Some were purely practical, others symbolic, intricately laced with code, designed to outlive the purifying flames. And then there is the tower itself. It was destroyed during the 100 Years' War, rebuilt, and later abandoned. Today it stands as little more than a ruin, but a modern archaeological team working there in 2009 unearthed an anomaly beneath what was once the map room. A sealed chamber with no doorway. Inside, fragments of charred parchment, no text remained. But one scrap held an unmistakable symbol. The Templar cross, exquisitely wrapped in a halo of 7 stars. A quiet epilogue, or perhaps the profound prologue to something still unfolding. Because maps do not merely chart distance, they chart intent. And those knights, they may have vanished from history, but their direction unequivocally, it is still on the wall. They were not supposed to be there. And yet the sagas emphatically state they came. Not the Vikings, but others, cloaked in white, bearing crosses, speaking no known tongue. Near the old settlements of Greenland, long after the Norse colonies had begun their slow fade into snow and silence, a story emerged. In it, the final Norse chieftain spoke of foreign pilgrims who meticulously followed the stars, not east to Iceland, but west, always west, toward the lands where the sea meets the fire. For centuries, these stories were buried beneath layers of frost and skepticism. Norse mythology, after all, abounds with intrepid travelers. But in the 14th century Skalholt map, meticulously drawn in Iceland, something peculiar appears. A chain of islands stretching westward, terminating in a land labeled Hvitra Manaland, white man's land. It was said to be inhabited by fair-skinned people in long robes who arrived not for war, but with books of light. No swords, no sails, just scrolls and stars. It is an established historical fact that the Norse reached Greenland by the late 10th century, and likely touched parts of North America shortly thereafter. But Hvitra-Manaland, as described in the sagas and copied into several Icelandic maps, is distinctly not Vinland. It lies farther south and deeper inland, and while mainstream scholars conveniently dismiss these legends as distorted memories of Irish monks, a few dissenting voices have long pointed out the astonishing congruence between the descriptions of these mysterious travelers and the known habits of a very specific kind of European monastic warrior, the Templars. The Templars were renowned for their profound obsession with the stars. Their headquarters in Jerusalem was meticulously constructed with careful alignment to solstices. Their rule books included prayers dictated by precise celestial timings. And their ships, unlike most medieval vessels, carried advanced tools that unequivocally suggest nocturnal navigation, a rare and sophisticated practice at the time. Star paths, as they were known, relied on a technique meticulously imported from Arabic astronomy. One such path, when plotted westward from Portugal, cuts directly through the North Atlantic and makes landfall near Labrador. Follow it further, and you reach the St. Lawrence River, and then the vast interior. A 15th century manuscript in the Reykjavik University archive references a Christian brotherhood from the south who visited Greenland, not to convert, but to inquire. One passage compellingly reads, "They sought the stone of knowledge, the one born beneath Polaris, Polaris the North Star, always present, always pointing." But here is where the echo settles in with a gentle yet profound weight. That very star appears again subtly in the cipher of Montségur, where the phrase lux septem, light of seven, is paired with a symbol resembling a compass rose tilted northward. It also appears in the Genoese Codex as a fixed anchor point for a 7-point grid. And now in the Norse tales, Polaris transcends mere navigation, becoming a metaphysical reference. A stone or marker guiding pilgrims towards something buried not just in land, but in profound meaning. The most controversial detail surfaces in an unassuming parish record from Iceland, dated 1383. It meticulously mentions a funeral held for 2 foreign holy men who tragically died during a storm. No names are given, just crosses on their chests and a peculiar possession. A brass disc engraved with constellations unlike anything local craftsmen could possibly produce. The disc is gone, lost to time, or perhaps confiscated by later officials. But the entry remains, quietly hinting that someone somewhere brought advanced celestial knowledge with them to a place no medieval knight should ever have reached. Interpretations diverge. Some argue these were rogue monks, members of an obscure Irish order with pre-Templar seafaring roots. Others believe they were Templari fugitivus, Templars who escaped the arrests and, guided by ancient Norse charts and sophisticated Moorish navigation tools, followed Polaris not to escape, but to fulfill. Fulfill what? That is the crux of the debate. A few believe they were meticulously tracing ancient paths laid out in apocryphal texts, texts that described 7 waypoints across the globe where knowledge from a forgotten age was profoundly hidden. One such waypoint, according to this theory, lies beneath a frozen lake in northern Quebec, a site long revered as sacred by the Cree people who speak of visitors that came from the sky and walked with silent sandals. Silence again. That unmistakable Templar hallmark, a vow, a strategic imperative, a survival mechanism. In that frozen world where sun and time blur, a group of travelers could have vanished easily, their ships claimed by ice, their records buried, and yet their trail, if genuine, remains written not on maps, but in enduring myth, a myth carried by the star that never moves. Perhaps that was the secret all along. Not the cities, not the gold, but the sky. The true map etched in constellations, invisible to those who look downward. Because the path west does not begin on land, it begins with Polaris, and those who followed it may not have been chasing mere treasure. They may have been answering a profound call. It is easy to envision gold vaults overflowing, jewels clinking into goblets, the kind of treasure that ignites wars and funds empires. But the Templars were never merely bankers. Their greatest treasures were not always forged from metal. They were relics, Bones, scrolls, cups, slivers of wood, cloths touched by saints, the kind of items that compelled emperors to kneel and popes to tremble. If any of those objects truly vanished when the order fell, as many unequivocally believe, then the real question becomes, where did they go? One historical fact rarely disputed is that the Templars held custody of several major relics, both verified and rumored. Among them, fragments of the true cross, a vial of Mary's milk, a cloth said to have wrapped the head of John the Baptist, and at least one item that some whispered might be the Holy Grail itself. That last one, of course, invites immediate skepticism. But what matters far more than the object itself is the profound belief it inspired. Because if the Templars genuinely believed they possessed something immensely powerful, profoundly holy, or catastrophically dangerous, then meticulously hiding it would have been their absolute highest priority. And what better way to conceal something than by moving it utterly out of reach and completely off the map? The relic route theory compellingly suggests that the westward voyages undertaken by Templar fugitives after 1307 were not desperate treasure hunts but meticulously organized treasure escorts. Protective missions, strategic retreats. And the map they followed, the one bearing the 7 enigmatic marks, was not a path to material wealth but a pilgrimage, a sacred spiritual deposit route. One meticulously chosen site per object, one city per profound secret. What gives this theory its strange gravity is not merely the relics themselves, but the telling behavior of those who came after. The Order of Christ, formally founded in Portugal shortly after the Templars' brutal suppression, quietly absorbed much of their infrastructure. Its knights took up residence in the very same castles, sailed from the identical ports, and inherited the same mysterious wealth. Crucially, they also adopted a peculiar fixation with relics. Early inventories from Tomar mention sealed crates labeled with Latin initials, now undecipherable. Some of these were apparently never opened, not even by the kings who directly bankrolled their keepers. And then there are the churches. In certain remote parts of the Americas, particularly in areas never officially settled by early colonists, there exist persistent stories of crosses found deep in the wilderness. Not Spanish in style, not Franciscan. These are simple, flared, carved from stone, sometimes accompanied by enigmatic circles of standing rocks. Indigenous tribes in these regions, when questioned about their origin, offer eerily similar responses. They were already here before the invaders, before the cities. In 1914, a trapper in the New Mexico highlands stumbled upon just such a site. He reported a stone circle with a low altar at its center. Beneath it, a small chamber meticulously sealed with clay, containing remnants of what appeared to be linen wrapped around a flat, palm-sized disc. The disc itself was missing, taken, sold, lost. But the wrapping bore a faded red pigment forming a shape strikingly reminiscent of the Jerusalem cross. The discovery was never publicized, but a copy of the trapper's journal survives in a dusty corner of the Santa Fe Historical Archive. Critics dismiss it as hearsay, mere coincidence. But the echo here is sharp. In earlier accounts from Montségur, from Rosslyn, from Nova Scotia, we have observed scattered signs of a consistent pattern. 7 locations, 7 points of reference. If the relic route theory holds, each of those places was not merely a stop, but a shrine, a lockbox, not to be worshipped, but to be patiently waited for. This raises profoundly uncomfortable questions. Why hide holy objects in lands utterly unknown? Why scatter them rather than protect them in a single formidable location? One controversial interpretation, whispered in esoteric circles, suggests the Templars were following a prophecy that something cataclysmic was approaching, something that would render Europe unsafe for truth. Not merely persecution, but utter erasure. The church could burn heretics, kings could burn documents, but they could not burn geography. Not if it was too distant, too wild, too sacred in its own right. A 14th century Templar fragment recovered near Toulouse mentions a phrase repeated 3 times. Lux occidentis custodit sanguinem. The light of the west guards the blood. Interpret it literally, and it sounds like a desperate escape plan. Interpret it spiritually, and it transforms into a theology. A profound belief that salvation or continuity could be preserved not through dominance, but through strategic dispersion. It is a haunting idea that the 7 cities were never physical cities, that they were reliquaries, caches, vaults designed not for immediate access but for prolonged delay, marked by stars, guarded by profound silence, and bound by an unwavering loyalty to something far greater than mere gold. Because what if the Templars were not chasing a myth? What if they were meticulously becoming one? It begins with an ephemeral shimmer, a glint on the horizon, a seductive promise. Then come the names: Cibola, Gran Quivira, like spells whispered across wind-worn deserts. For the Spanish conquistadors, these were not merely stories. They were consuming obsessions. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado relentlessly marched across the baking plains of the American Southwest, chasing tales of cities plated in pure gold. Hernán Cortés heard persistent rumors from Aztec priests about lands to the north where gold flowed like water, and where enigmatic strangers cloaked in robes and wielding fire came and went long before the empire rose. But none of them ever found what they were truly seeking. Only ruin, only silence, only death. The 7 cities of gold always remained just beyond reach, perpetually gleaming from the next valley, the next formidable mountain pass. Yet no one, not Coronado, not Fray Marcos de Niza, not even the desperate treasure hunters centuries later, ever found a city explicitly made of gold. They found pueblos, cliff dwellings, sacred shrines, places of immense beauty, certainly. But no vaults, no towering spires, and unequivocally no altars crusted with material treasure. The established fact is this: no archaeological evidence has ever conclusively confirmed the existence of literal golden cities in North America. And yet the stories persist. They echo from tribe to tribe, from expedition journal to whispered folklore, not as mere fantasy but as a chilling warning. In 1540, while relentlessly chasing rumors of Cibola, Coronado's expedition famously encountered the Zuni people. He anticipated grandeur. Instead, he found a modest stone settlement of homes, sacred kivas, and wary, distrustful stares. No gold, no opulence, just an ancient community profoundly confused and irritated by the arrival of armed men with utterly impossible expectations. Coronado, refusing to accept this stark truth, pushed onward. His men became disoriented, supplies dwindled, morale utterly collapsed. And then came the inevitable death. Soldiers collapsing from heat, drowning in sudden flash floods, or succumbing to their own fevered hallucinations. One friar in Coronado's company wrote, "These lands are cursed by silence. They answer only with wind, and yet the Templars, if they were ever truly here, did not appear to meet the same tragic fate. No legends of conquest, no mass graves, just elusive hints, runes on rocks, crosses in the hills, shrines with no discernible local origin, as if the land itself accepted them, or at the very least tolerated their presence. This profound contrast leads to a chilling possibility. What if the 7 cities were never meant to be found? Not by force, not by greed. What if they were meticulously designed traps, not to ensnare the faithful, but to test the seeker? A controversial interpretation advanced by historian Ignacio Cordera in the 1950s argued that the legends of gold were deliberately seeded. He believed the Templars, or their direct heirs, left these stories behind in carefully chosen places, utilizing symbols and oral channels to guide only those who were spiritually or intellectually prepared. To others, like the conquistadors, these very same markers would inevitably lead to suffering, profound confusion, and ultimate failure. Cordera famously called it the curse of the trail. Not a literal curse with hexes and ghosts, but a philosophical one, that the very act of desiring gold in the form of material wealth blinds the seeker to what is truly hidden. Here comes the undeniable echo, inevitable now. The map with 7 crosses, the carvings in Cordoba, the petroglyphs near the Rio Grande, the cipher of Montségur. All of them point toward places where treasure is not taken but interpreted. Places where light falls in a particular significant way, where geometry whispers in profound silence, where gold is less about glittering ore and more about profound knowledge. Could the conquistadors have stumbled upon these very places? Possibly, but they demonstrably did not possess the perception to truly see them. The Templars, meticulously trained in sacred geometry, encoded texts, and rituals of profound concealment, may have known better. They may have meticulously designed the map not as a route for acquisition, but as an intricate veil, a lock, a filter. There is a half-forgotten story from an Apache elder near the Arizona border. She recounted a place where foreign men came long ago, before the horse, before the iron. These men, she said, built no homes, lit no fires. They came, marked the stones, and left. When asked why they came, she answered simply, they were following their ghosts. Ghosts, memory, or perhaps a profound legacy. What if the 7 cities were the final vaults of a dying order, constructed not of stone and gold, but of silence and stars? What if they were never meant to be discovered by conquistadors or even by us? What if they are patiently waiting for someone to cease chasing and begin truly listening? Because perhaps the curse was not upon the cities. Perhaps it was all along upon the question itself. The stories arrive slowly, like silt settling in a riverbed. A rumor here, a half-whispered memory there, and always they converge on the same place. It is a narrow valley carved by the Rio Hondo, nestled deep within the high desert of northern New Mexico. Today it is quiet, just dry grass, cottonwoods, and the occasional rusted gate. But to the old families of the region, this valley is not merely empty land. It is sacred. It is meticulously watched. And somewhere beneath it, they assert, lies something that profoundly resists discovery. The earliest written record dates to the late 1600s, when a Franciscan friar passing through the area noted a strange local legend about white priests who came from the east long ago. These men, he wrote, spoke in a language no one recognized, bore no firearms, and carried a long wooden chest which they buried beneath the eye of the mountain. They left no church, no converts, just a circle of stones and a chilling warning. What lies below is not to be opened until the stars return to their place. At the time, the story was dismissed as mere native superstition, but later, much later, others came looking. In 1887, a pair of prospectors from Missouri claimed to have discovered foreign coins and a carved cross near the Rio Hondo after following up on what one of them cryptically called the ghost map. He refused to elaborate. The coins were purportedly copper, crudely struck with symbols unlike any Spanish colonial mint. Their find quickly disappeared, swallowed by the hands of a private collector. But one fragment resurfaced decades later. A cross pate, flared and symmetrical, etched into a flat piece of slate. The same unmistakable Templar design seen in chapels on shields and carved into rock across the Atlantic. Locals, when questioned, grow quiet. Some speak vaguely of the Guardians, men in plain clothes who have kept watch over the valley for generations. Not park rangers, not police, simply watchers. One old rancher recounted that his grandfather had told him never to dig near the old bend in the river because it sings at night. When pressed on what that meant, the man merely chuckled and said, "You'll know when you hear it. It is an established pattern now. A relic route, a map, 7 distinct marks. And this valley, remote, untouched, aligned with the solar paths meticulously traced by earlier chapters, sits squarely in a theoretical position that would unequivocally make it the 6th or 7th node. The treasure of the Rio Hondo then might not be treasure at all, but a repository, a terminal vault, the ultimate end of a clandestine trail. But here comes the twist, perhaps the most chilling yet. In the 1930s, a small team of amateur archaeologists from Santa Fe quietly conducted a dig in the valley. Their records were never officially published, but a single letter discovered years later in a family archive meticulously describes what they unearthed. A sealed chamber beneath 6 feet of compacted clay, lined with stones arranged in a 7-pointed star. Inside, they reported finding a stone box bound with iron. They opened it. The letter abruptly ends there. No inventory, no explanation. Just a hastily scrolled note on the back. We should not have touched it. Whatever they found, it either profoundly frightened them or was forcibly removed. The site was subsequently refilled. No markers remain. The land is now privately owned, fenced off, patrolled. A soft, subtle echo drifts in from earlier accounts. The parchment from Portugal, the 7 crosses, the reference to a refuge that left La Rochelle. If the escape fleet indeed carried something, some final object too dangerous or too sacred to risk in Europe, it would have desperately needed a resting place somewhere far-flung, hidden by time, protected by geography and impenetrable mystery. The Rio Hondo perfectly fits this description. And then there is the dream, a recurring vision reported by those who visit the valley. They speak of hearing water running underground, though no stream visibly exists. They describe enigmatic shapes in the rocks, dots, lines, and once, someone spoke of seeing a red light beneath the earth like embers that never cooled. Controversial, certainly, possibly delusional, but the pattern once again persists. 7, cross, star, silence. The treasure may not be gold. It may not even be physical. It may be an idea, a profound secret, a last message from men who recognized that the world was irrevocably changing and chose to bury what mattered most beneath a river that rarely floods and never truly forgets. Because sometimes the greatest treasures are not meant to be found. They are meant to wait. There is a strange, persistent pattern in the chronicles of the early missionaries. Not the flamboyant entries detailing burned idols and loud conversions, but rather the stark absences, the inexplicable gaps. Roads once meticulously documented by conquistadors vanish from Franciscan maps. Cities that appeared on one priest's parchment are quietly scrubbed from the next. Questions openly asked in one generation are inexplicably hushed in the next. In the vast, intricate tapestry of colonization, it is easy to overlook these subtle yet profound edits. But if one looks closely, one can discern the indelible fingerprints of something or someone meticulously tidying up the trail behind them. The Franciscans arrived in the Americas with fire in their eyes and parchment in their packs. Their mission was clear: evangelize, baptize, and meticulously organize. Yet among their ranks were scholars, linguists, and more than a few individuals with long, selective memories. Men who had studied in Iberian monasteries built atop former Templar strongholds. Men whose mentors once whispered of maps that led not east to Jerusalem, but resolutely west, toward a forbidden geography. One such figure was Fray Diego de Landa, infamous for burning Maya codices while simultaneously cataloging their language with obsessive detail. He was not alone. Across Mexico, New Mexico, and parts of the Southwest, friars kept notes, private, coded, often hidden, about strange ruins, unusual crosses, and indigenous oral histories that spoke of visitors who arrived long before Spain ever flew its flag. An established fact: several early missions were constructed directly atop indigenous sacred sites, not by accident, demonstrably by deliberate design. The Franciscans often chose locations with existing spiritual resonance, but in certain crucial cases, the alignment was not merely spiritual, it was profoundly astronomical. Missions aligned to solstices, equinoxes, and intricate star patterns that uncannily mirrored those found in European Gothic cathedrals. A curious overlap, considering the Templars were known to utilize those same precise alignments when constructing their chapels centuries earlier. One specific location in particular raises significant questions. The ruins of a mission near the Pecos River in New Mexico, long buried by sand and flood, was discovered to be oriented not toward Jerusalem, but precisely toward the northwest, along a line that, if extended, intersects precisely with a stone formation near the Rio Hondo, marked with 7 carved circles. Does this sound familiar? A powerful echo rises again from the dust: the Chapel of Silence in Cordoba, the cipher of Montségur. The compass rose in the ruined Templar tower, all bearing variations of the 7-pointed mark, all oriented not toward conquest but profound concealment. The theory, controversial yet gaining traction in academic backrooms, is this: The Franciscans inherited more than just doctrine. Some inherited fragments of the forbidden map, not officially, not publicly, but quietly passed from monk to monk, from scroll to scroll. And when they arrived in the New World, they recognized things. Symbols, alignments, specific sites, and rather than acknowledge them, they meticulously erased them. One missionary diary, written in cipher and later decoded by a Jesuit scholar, contains a chilling line that reads, "The path of the old brothers is still here. I have seen the seventh door. We will bury it anew." No further explanation is offered, but the phrasing, "old brothers, that seventh door," invites profound speculation. Were the Franciscans covering old Templar roots to protect them or to protect themselves from them? Some believe it was purely theological rivalry. Others suggest it was fear. That whatever the Templars brought or found terrified the Church's agents. Too heretical, too pagan, or perhaps simply too true. And then there is the matter of the erased maps. Several missionary atlases from the 16th century display dramatic inconsistencies. One version of a route through Arizona features a detailed depiction of a ruin shaped like a key. The very next edition, published just years later, removes it entirely. A terse note in the margin reads, "Locum non repeats. Do not return to the place." No explanation, no trace, just a direct instruction. One that feels less like theology and more like urgent damage control. The truth may lie in the overlap. The Templars sought refuge. The Franciscans, perhaps unknowingly, found it. And when they did, they recognized something dangerous, something they could not control. And so they built over it, buried it, rewrote it. The trail to the 7 cities was not lost in the wilderness. It was meticulously edited out, one blessing at a time. The greatest concealment is not destruction. It is subtle, pervasive replacement. Because when a story is burned, we mourn it. But when it is rewritten, we forget it ever existed. It should not exist. And yet there it is, etched into brittle vellum, lines drawn with the steady hand of a seasoned seafarer, not a scholar. The Zeno map, published in 1558 but purportedly based on documents from over a century earlier, charts a world that should not have been known. Not then, not by them. It depicts parts of Greenland in startling detail, outlines of North America decades before official discovery, and most hauntingly marks an island never fully identified near the center of the Atlantic, bearing a series of crosses, 7 to be exact. The established version of events posits that the map was compiled by Niccolò Zeno, a Venetian noble, based on letters and records from his ancestors Niccolò and Antonio Zeno. These brothers, the story goes, journeyed north in the 1390s, well before Columbus, to explore the far reaches of the Atlantic under the direction of a mysterious prince named Zikmani. A name unfamiliar to most, but possibly a corruption of Sinclair, as in Henry Sinclair of Rosslyn Chapel fame. This is where the narrative begins to tremble. According to the letters, Zikmani led voyages beyond Iceland, past Greenland, and toward a land the documents cryptically call Estotiland. It was fertile, rich in rivers, home to people who spoke no known tongue. No gold is explicitly mentioned, no grand cathedrals. But the writings refer in veiled terms to a land that remembered. Remembered what, they do not say. Skeptics predictably denounce the map as a Renaissance hoax, a product of the age's obsession with pre-Columbian contact theories. but certain details stubbornly resist dismissal. The map's outline of Greenland, for example, bears a surprising resemblance to its true shape beneath the ice, something unconfirmed until satellite imaging centuries later. Even more disconcerting is the presence of islands in the Atlantic that correspond, at least roughly, to the Azores, Madeira, and an unnamed landmass west of them marked not with names but with 7 small crosses. It is this detail, the 7, that ripples outward like a chilling current, because once again, it undeniably connects. Rosslyn, Nova Scotia, Cordoba, the cipher at Montségur. Each has revealed a version of this recurring motif. Now it appears again, subtly in the heart of a controversial map with supposed roots in a time when Templar remnants may still have roamed the seas. And the timing is suspiciously perfect. The Zeno brothers are said to have embarked on their voyage in 1390, approximately 80 years after the fall of the Templars. Just enough time for a new generation, unburdened by chains and stake smoke, to meticulously plan something truly audacious. There is a line in the Zeno letters that often goes overlooked. It reads, "We found not gold, but an order older than the cross, written in stone and silence." It sounds poetic, mystical, perhaps even fabricated. But taken in context, amidst the speculation, the enigmatic names, the undeniable geographic anomalies, it resonates like a profound message. A controversial interpretation suggests that the Zeno expedition was not one of mere chance, but one of rediscovery. That Zikmani Sinclair was meticulously retracing a route already charted, perhaps passed down from the maps once housed in the Tower of Sainte Marie, or from scrolls smuggled aboard the fleet that mysteriously vanished from La Rochelle. If true, then the Zeno map may be a snapshot of the forgotten trail, a literal artifact of the lost route to the 7 cities. Not the golden spires imagined by conquistadors, but the quiet, strategic vaults meticulously built for preservation, not plunder. In 1974, a private collector claimed to have acquired a fragment of a map nearly identical to Zeno's, drawn on rough sheepskin with annotations in a coded alphabet resembling Templar shorthand. He vehemently refused to display it, stating it was too powerful. When pressed on what he meant, he replied, "Because it tells a story no one wants to hear." A powerful echo flickers here, subtle, familiar. The stars of Polaris guiding the Knights of the North Star, the runic carvings of Nova Scotia, the forgotten Franciscan footnotes. All are signs pointing to one compelling idea, that a map once existed. One true map passed down like a sacred relic, drawn and redrawn, each iteration obscured slightly more than the last until only suggestion remained. A cartographic game of telephone, truth in layers. So perhaps the Zeno map is not the hoax. Perhaps it is the last faint echo of a story too vast to survive unbroken. And perhaps those 7 crosses are not merely symbols of hope. Perhaps they are stark warnings. It washed ashore after a tumultuous storm. Not glittering gold, not sacred relics, just fragments of wood and bronze, twisted, battered, aged beyond any reasonable explanation. The discovery occurred in 1896 off the coast of Rhode Island, near a shallow inlet long whispered about by local fishermen as the graveyard of sails. At first glance, the wreck appeared unremarkable, another casualty of the Atlantic's insatiable appetite. But a diver more curious than most brought up a piece of timber bearing an iron ring and something else, faint, worn but unmistakable. A cross. Not just any cross, but a Templar cross. Flared arms, symmetrical, simple, silent. To this day, no one can adequately explain how it got there. There is an established historical account of a vessel found in the late 19th century, with undeniable European design elements predating Columbus by at least a century. The wood was oak, unequivocally native to Iberia. The fastenings were of a style explicitly used in Mediterranean shipbuilding of the 1300s, and embedded in one of the beams was a small copper disc, no larger than a coin, bearing the same red cross flanked by 2 dots. A maritime symbol, a seal of ownership, or a message encoded in profound simplicity. The object has since disappeared. Last known in the possession of a private collector in New York, it was rumored to have changed hands several times before vanishing altogether. But photographs were taken, meticulous drawings archived, and the symbol has been meticulously compared by independent researchers to those found in Templar strongholds in southern France, most notably in a wall carving near the ruined commandery of Arles. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Historians dismissed it as coincidence. The cross, they argued, was a common Christian emblem. The ship could easily have been a later vessel, Spanish perhaps, lost in an undocumented storm. But the materials did not match 16th century Spanish shipbuilding, and more tellingly, the design of the hull fragments unequivocally suggested a deeper keel, optimized for long, arduous crossings, not mere coastal hugging. This is where the story truly tilts. One local tale passed down through the Narragansett people of the region describes a boat of bones that came from the east before the fire bears, presumed to mean the colonists. The story tells of pale men who landed, made no demands, and built a stone ring inland before disappearing. No war, no trade, just arrival and profound silence. Archaeologists have uncovered no verifiable stone ring, but in 1981, a group of hikers discovered a circular arrangement of boulders deep in the woods near Watch Hill. At its center, a shallow depression and a stone bearing 7 indentations in a crescent. The pattern is now undeniably familiar, the motif that has followed us across oceans and centuries. 7 points, 7 gates, 7 cities, and now perhaps a 7th vessel. A powerful echo surfaces like driftwood. The Genoese map with an unlabeled island, the Nova Scotia carvings, the brass disc in Iceland, all scattered pieces of a trail deliberately left behind, not to invite pursuit, but to test profound perception. The Templars, if they truly reached these shores, would not have constructed fortresses. They would have hidden, adapted, waited. And what were they carrying? That question remains shrouded in fog. But if the relic route theory holds, if the ships bore items of profound spiritual or historical value, then this wreck may not have been just a transport. It may have been an ark, one of several, each bound for a separate point, each tasked with preserving a critical part of the whole. There is a fringe theory, controversial of course, that claims the Templars modeled their voyages not only on known geography but on revelation itself, that they sought 7 vaults, 7 seals, 7 watchtowers to guard what they called Lux Occidentis, the light of the West, a term seen scrolled on a Templar scroll recovered in Tomar and again in the Montségur cipher. The light, some argue, was not divine. It was knowledge, a final truth, something unrecorded, something that had to be meticulously scattered and buried, and so the ship may have been more than a mere relic runner. It may have been carrying a fragment of that light, and if it sank, if it failed, then part of that trail went irrevocably dark. But the symbol remains, faint, weathered, patiently waiting on the edge of a continent it was never meant to reach. Carved by hands that history claims were long gone, on a ship that was never supposed to be built, bound for a land no map was officially allowed to name. Maybe it was the last. Maybe it was just one of many. But it touched the shore, and for one brief, tantalizing moment, the map was undeniably real. History possesses a curious habit of forgetting individuals once they cross a vast ocean. Names vanish, lineages blur. But sometimes, if you listen intently in the forgotten corners of ancient towns or read meticulously between the lines of dusty parish registries, something profoundly strange begins to emerge. Threads that should have been irrevocably severed with the fall of the Templars, still pulsing quietly across the Atlantic. One confirmed fact. Following the dissolution of the order in 1307, many former Templars vanished into profound obscurity. Some were absorbed into the Hospitallers. Some sought shelter under new identities, particularly in Scotland and Portugal. But among these so-called disappearances are at least a dozen noble names with meticulously documented ties to the Templar hierarchy. Names that abruptly vanish from European archives and curiously reappear generations later in wholly unexpected places like early colonial Virginia, or remote parishes in the Yucatan, or mission towns along the Rio Grande, where surnames carry strange echoes of Occitan and Old French. A genealogical puzzle, certainly, but one that leads to unsettling patterns. In 1972, a team of researchers at a university in Seville uncovered a bundle of letters written by Spanish priests in New Spain during the mid-1500s. Buried among the reports of conversions and complaints about mosquitoes were several notes concerning settlers whose manner and customs seemed oddly archaic. One priest described a family whose patriarch insisted on being addressed as Magister, refused confession unless facing west, and wore a signet ring depicting a sword surrounded by 7 stars. No one in the colony knew where he had truly come from. Even stranger is the case of the Delgado Archive, a collection of legal and familial records discovered in a crumbling church in northern Mexico. Within it is the will of a Don Mateo Delgado dated 1589, who claims direct descent from a Brotherhood of the Temple and explicitly describes his lineage as keepers of the hidden root. His children, according to the document, were instructed to maintain a small chapel where the 7th hill points toward the evening sun. The exact location has never been definitively verified. Another echo arises, faint but strikingly familiar. The 7 marks, the directional symbolism, the pervasive obsession with quiet preservation, and the compelling idea that whatever the Templars were hiding did not just involve specific places or precious objects, but people. A controversial theory, rarely voiced outside niche academic circles, suggests that the Templars did not merely flee west with maps and relics, but with bloodlines. That certain families, those entrusted with sacred duties, were deliberately relocated not simply for safety, but for profound continuity to subtly seed something. a remnant community bound not by land but by a shared, enduring memory, skeptical naturally. Genealogy is notoriously tangled, and names alone prove little. But then there are the traditions. A family in Taos, New Mexico has long passed down a ritual prayer in Old French, despite having no documented French ancestry. Another family in southern Texas has, for generations, maintained an annual silent vigil on March 18th, the date of Jacques de Molay's execution, claiming it as a day of watchful mourning. They emphatically state it has nothing to do with saints or local feast days, only remembrance. A 17th century missionary wrote of a noble convert among the Pueblo people who wore a robe stitched with the emblem of a red cross. He had no European parentage, claimed he had received the robe from his father, who had received it from a traveler long ago. The traveler had no name, only a book and a map he never showed. Coincidence? Invention? Or the faded yet indelible imprint of something once highly organized, now dissolved into enduring legend? Even in the American Southeast, some of the earliest lost colonies held families with names like Rochford, Meade, and Dunn. Names that strikingly match known Templar commanders in 13th century France. The connection remains tenuous, the records patchy, but the trail stubbornly persists. And so the critical question becomes not just where did the Templars go, but who did they become? If the map was not merely a document but a profound directive, then blood would matter, lineage would matter. Carriers of knowledge, perhaps bred not for privilege but for memory, for bearing the immense weight of something that could not be spoken, only meticulously preserved. A final, uncomfortable theory suggests the map of the 7 cities was not a treasure map at all. It was a genealogical diagram, a living trail, encoded not in lines on parchment but in flesh and name. And perhaps the real treasure was never meant to be unearthed from the soil but awakened in memory. In the descendant who still feels drawn to forgotten stones, in the child who dreams of stars arranged in 7. In the keeper who does not fully comprehend what he is guarding, only that he must, because sometimes legacy is not built in stone. It walks beside us, unknowing yet unbroken. The ledgers, by all accounts, should meticulously balance. Yet they consistently defy reconciliation. For all the galleons that groaned into port at Seville, for all the chests painstakingly counted and sealed, for all the imperial proclamations trumpeting divine abundance, the mathematics stubbornly refused to cooperate. Year after year, colonial treasuries report figures that fall short, by a little at first, then by a staggering margin. Somewhere between the arduous jungle mines of the New World and the meticulous counting houses of Castile, vast amounts of treasure simply evaporated. The Spanish crown was notoriously meticulous in its accounting. Every shipment was logged, every chest weighed, every ingot hammered with royal seals. The Casa de Contratación in Seville, Spain's official clearinghouse for colonial trade, maintained obsessive records. And yet historians have long noted that beginning in the late 1500s, the documented wealth extracted from the Americas consistently fails to match the expected output from mines like Zacatecas and Potosí, and even small-scale coastal smelters. Initially, corruption was the convenient scapegoat. Local governors, crooked captains, rogue merchants, standard culprits. But investigations, when actually conducted, yielded remarkably few culprits. And then came the whispers. Cargoes that never arrived. Manifests mysteriously altered in invisible ink. Ships that vanished without a trace of pirate attack or storm. Not one or two, but dozens of vessels that departed with treasure and were never seen again. This leads to a haunting theory. Someone was systematically intercepting them. Or perhaps, more chillingly still, some treasure was never intended to leave the New World at all. An obscure archive in Cartagena, Colombia, contains a letter dated 1613, written by a merchant named Baltazar Jimenez. In it, he bitterly complains of strange interference with his shipments and references a local family of foreign friars who operate a small port farther up the coast. He warns that they speak little, travel by night, and their chapel faces not east but west. The phrasing is casual. He suspects mere smuggling. But the orientation of the chapel, as we have now repeatedly seen, is anything but casual. A powerful echo stirs from the Chapel of Silence in Cordoba, from the shrine near the Rio Hondo, from the forgotten vaults beneath Sagres, west-facing sanctuaries, not by mistake but by deliberate design. The suggestion here is subtle but undeniable. Someone else had access to New World gold. Not to hoard it, not to spend it, but to move it, divert it, possibly even return it to the very places marked on that forbidden map. Another record, this time from a Spanish inquisitor traveling through Veracruz, notes a disturbing find in a remote village. An abandoned villa, entirely empty except for one room. On its walls, 7 cruciform markings. On the floor, a single stone bearing the imprint of a hand and a word carved in Old Occitan. Ol, meaning house or sanctuary. There was no sign of violence, no sign of anyone ever living there. But the stone had been polished smooth, by footsteps perhaps, or prayer. What if some of the gold that never reached Spain never truly left its source? What if it was redirected not for rebellion but for ritual, as offerings to points along a route older than empire, older than Rome, a route designed not to extract but to preserve? The controversial interpretation, often whispered and rarely published, is this: the Templar map was more than symbolic. It was not merely a guide to buried relics or lost cities. It was an intricate economic network, a shadow infrastructure meticulously designed to survive empire suppressions, even the church itself. Not for profit, but for profound continuity. Each of the 7 sites may have received gold, but not to construct thrones or bribe kings. Rather, to fund monasteries in the wilderness, to finance covert passages, to build libraries or tunnels or sophisticated traps. One legend found in the writings of a 17th century Guarani priest tells of a golden book bound in iron, hidden in a cave beyond the reach of sunlight. It sings when the stars return, he wrote, and its keepers are not men but memory. The passage reads like poetry, but in context with everything else we have uncovered, it feels more like meticulous record-keeping. Because if the gold was used not to shine but to shield, if it was used to bury, to seal, to protect, then the greatest vaults of the Americas might not have been constructed above ground. They might have been grown, overgrown, absorbed by jungle and mountain, a trail not of cities but of profound absences. And in every royal archive that reveals a shortfall, a silence, a clue. Because because sometimes treasure isn't what's found, it's what's missing. There exists a place in the desert where compasses mysteriously fail. Not entirely, not dramatically, just enough to profoundly disorient. The needle hesitates, then subtly drifts a few degrees west. It corrects itself moments later as if embarrassed. But that fleeting hesitation has sent more than one expedition spiraling off course, deeper into a desolate no-man's land of red rock, thornbrush, and towering mesas that cast afternoon shadows like cathedral spires. The locals call it Dead Wind Gap. Others with less poetic flair have simply marked it on maps with X's or slashes or avoided it altogether. But the old stories persist. Beneath one particular mesa, flat-topped, sun-scorched, and utterly unremarkable to the casual eye, lies something profoundly buried. Not necessarily gold. Something far older, something meticulously sealed. The tale first surfaced in the journal of Lieutenant James Edward Spencer, a Union surveyor dispatched in 1873 to meticulously chart the area for a proposed telegraph line. Spencer, a man of science and maddening precision, described stumbling upon a fissure in the base of the mesa during a fierce storm. Seeking shelter, he ventured inward and discovered a passage carved not by wind or water, but by deliberate hand, smooth stone, precise geometric lines. He reported finding a chamber, empty save for a disc and 3 concentric circles etched into the floor like a target waiting for something to be placed at its center. He returned the next morning to investigate further. The fissure was gone. Geological instability was blamed, of course. The desert is replete with mirages and sudden mood swings. But Spencer's journal included a meticulous sketch, one later matched to a carving found in a Templar chapel outside Arles, a design once believed to represent celestial alignment, but which may also depict a sophisticated vault-locking mechanism. The obscure detail is this. Nearby tribes, particularly the Jicarilla Apache, tell stories of a mountain that hums. Their oral traditions speak of a low vibration like a drumbeat beneath the sand, audible only at dusk. They say the place is cursed, that those who enter never truly return, not because they die, but because they choose never to leave. There have been attempts to excavate the mesa. Most have failed due to lack of funding, bureaucratic entanglement, or mysteriously revoked permits. In one instance, a team from a southwestern university began a ground-penetrating radar survey, only to report that their instruments inexplicably malfunctioned at the exact coordinates indicated in Spencer's notes. And then there is the photograph. Tucked into a forgotten appendix of a Smithsonian field report from 1924 is a black and white image labeled Uncatalogued Artifact, Mesa 12B. It shows a narrow stone tablet clearly broken, inscribed with Latin script and a stylized compass rose. The report describes it as likely colonial missionary in origin. But one Latin phrase stands out, carved just below the rose. Iterum videbis lumen in occidente. You will see the light again in the west. There is, of course, no further documentation. The artifact is listed as missing. This brings us to the profound question that scholars still tiptoe around like a sleeping serpent. What, if anything, lies beneath that mesa? A recent attempt to correlate early Spanish treasure routes with seismic anomalies in the region produced a curious overlap. The so-called Dulcinea fault line, long dismissed as geologically minor, runs directly beneath the site. But some believe the readings do not match tectonic shifts, They match cavities, man-made hollows, vaults. One geophysicist, speaking off the record, referred to them as chambers of non-random density. He laughed afterward, perhaps realizing how absurd it sounded. Or perhaps because he was not supposed to say it aloud. Because if the last map of the Templars pointed anywhere, it pointed here. Not with mere latitude and longitude, but with stories, with lost shipments, with vanishing friars and west-facing chapels and compasses that twitch at the very threshold of something far older than empire. The scholarly debate now pivots on the symbols, those concentric circles, that compass rose. Some argue they are religious, others astronomical. But a third theory, quietly gaining traction, proposes something else entirely. The map was not a guide to gold. It was a meticulous record of where gold was used to build, to hide, to guard. In which case, the 7 cities were never cities. They were vaults, and perhaps the final vault is the only one still sealed. Because after all, if you were hiding something so precious, so dangerously important that no king or pope should ever find it again, wouldn't you bury it somewhere no one would ever think to dig? Beneath profound silence, beneath solid stone, beneath a place so empty it effectively disappears from all maps. And then you would wait. For the right star, for the right seeker. Or perhaps you would wait forever. It was always about the shimmer. The way sunlight caught on tales told by firelight. How the very word gold seemed to stretch longer in the mouth when whispered in the hushed embrace of night. For centuries, the promise of the 7 cities of gold seduced the desperate, the devout, and the utterly deranged alike. Men crossed vast oceans, bravely endured scorching deserts, and tragically slaughtered thousands in relentless pursuit of glittering capitals they never found. But what if they were not looking for the wrong place, but merely the wrong thing? Somewhere along the twisting, intricate veins of history, metaphor solidified into myth. The original accounts, vague, inconsistent, and frequently secondhand, speak not of cities teeming with life, but of places aglow with divine radiance. The earliest indigenous descriptions portray not buildings but beacons, not material treasures, but profound revelations. And perhaps the most telling line of all comes not from a conquistador, but from an Aztec elder. They came not for gold, but for memory carved in light. That evocative phrase echoed oddly through a document discovered centuries later in a Franciscan codex, meticulously hidden among sermons and shipping inventories. In the margins, a friar had scrolled a Latin note beside an indecipherable diagram. Civitates non sunt urbe, sed viae sacrae. The cities are not cities, but sacred paths. And suddenly everything shifts. What if the 7 cities were never physical settlements at all, but rather points along a profound pilgrimage trail? Not bustling commercial centers, but cryptic stations. Not built with stone and mortar, but with profound knowledge and deliberate intent. Across multiple continents, diverse cultures have meticulously constructed geoglyphic networks that align with celestial bodies. The Nazca lines, the ley lines of Britain, the Dine people's stories of the Hoju, the harmonious path, all trace symbolic journeys rather than purely physical ones. In each case, geography transcends into theology. And if the Templars had encountered these profound ideas, either through indigenous contact or ancient sources clandestinely smuggled west, then their fabled map may not have been navigational in any modern sense. It was a ritual blueprint. Look back through the accumulating clues. The symbols in Montségur's parchments that eerily resembled alchemical glyphs. The compass rose carved beneath the mesa, pointing not north but toward the setting sun. The concentric circles in Nova Scotia mysteriously matching planetary orbits, not property lines. Each one a node, a stage, a complex riddle wrapped in sacred geometry. And consider this. The number 7 holds no inherent strategic logic in terms of city planning. But spiritually, it is ubiquitous. 7 sacraments, 7 heavens, 7 seals, 7 virtues, 7 sins. Even in Islamic cosmology, 7 earths and 7 skies. It is profoundly the number of divine progression, from initiation to ultimate revelation. So perhaps the Templars were not seeking to establish colonies. They were attempting to recreate a journey, one they believed had been walked before them, one that passed through symbolic thresholds, a cave, a spring, a mountain, a field where the stars mirrored the ground below, places where gold was not mined, but subtly melted into markers, sigils, profound invitations. This brings us to a tantalizing possibility. If the 7 cities were not destinations but functions, ritual sites meticulously aligned to unlock something when visited in sequence, then the map was never meant to lead to gold, but to profound transformation. Spiritual, metaphysical, perhaps even cosmological. That theory, while decidedly fringe, gained an unexpected advocate in the 1960s when Jesuit scholar Father Alessandro Duran published his controversial thesis, Via Occidentis, Pilgrimage and the Templar Psyche. Buried beneath meticulous Latin citations and theological meandering, he proposed that the Templars viewed the New World not as a territory, but as a crucial testing ground, a crucible where faith, profound silence, and distance from Rome could forge a purer, more authentic order. His critics were ruthless. He was quietly reassigned. But his notes remain, and one in particular is chillingly clear. They did not seek kingdoms but keys, and the cities were the locks. Even the name Cibola, when cross-referenced with obscure Arabic dialects, may not mean city at all. Some argue it derives from Sabala, meaning path of fire or line of illumination. Not a place to live, but a place to pass through. This would unequivocally explain why every attempt to find the cities failed, why no grand ruins emerged, why no gold was unearthed that matched the fevered reports. Because the reports were not wrong, merely profoundly misread. Gold was indeed involved, but as a language, not a currency. Molded into markers, melted into leaf, hidden within light. Recall how the supposed Templar shipwreck bore a tablet engraved with the phrase, Iterum videbis lumen in Occidente. You will see the light again in the West. If taken literally, it implies not just direction, but enlightenment, a sunrise in reverse, a new dawn at the very edge of the known world. So when cartographers drew those impossible maps of lands yet undiscovered, of islands shaped like chalices or suns, they were not merely guessing. They were remembering. Echoes passed through symbols, through vaults and chapels and forgotten charts, through stories dismissed as fantasy, because they were not pointing to land. They were pointing to profound understanding. This reframes the final question entirely. If the map was never a treasure map, but a meditation, If the journey was never about conquest but about comprehension, then the true treasure is not what patiently waits at the end. It is what irrevocably changes along the way. The 7 cities were never cities. They were profound messages, and maybe, just maybe, you have been walking the very first steps of that path tonight. You have journeyed far, through crumbling chapels and scorched archives, across wind-swept ports and sun-bleached mesas. You have meticulously followed the inked veins of a map that may never have been intended for casual eyes. You have stepped into vaults that no longer stand, heard whispers from stones that no longer speak, and traced a legend that has led everyone else to dust and madness. But now, gently everything quiets. Let us allow it to settle, because if that map was real, and the evidence strongly suggests it might have been, its compass did not point north. It pointed inward, not to mere riches, but to profound reckoning. The Templars were not hunting for mythical wealth. They were not fleeing with relics merely to preserve them. They were chasing a transformation, or guarding it, or perhaps, in the most profound sense, becoming it. Consider the way the stars shift at the horizon, the precise point where day seamlessly transitions into dream. How ancient sailors once spoke of a thinning, that strange, unsettling hush, when sky and sea seemed to overlap, when a compass needle would falter and birds would abruptly turn the other way. What if the final destination was not a where, but a when? The ultimate compass point was never meant to bring anyone back. It was meant to usher in the end of the known world, not through cataclysmic apocalypse, but through profound revelation. In the old chapel near Cordoba, beside that spiral symbol no one could decipher, was a phrase so worn it is barely legible now. But under the precise angle of light, you can still faintly make it out. Finis est initium. The end is the beginning. So here, at the very edge of every theory, beyond the reach of every expedition, we pause. Not because there is nowhere left to go, but because the map was never meant to lead you onward. It was meant to turn you around, to face a question older than gold, older than cities, older than profound silence, and the next step is not ours to take. So rest now. Let the fire burn low. Let the parchment curl back into the dark. Whatever the Templars saw across the sea or behind the veil, they carried it with them, in code, in blood, in legend. And whether they vanished entirely into myth or merely into memory, they left an indelible trail. But only for those willing to follow it without ever needing to officially arrive.